The diamond necklace receipt fell from Michelle's purse like a confession. 2 carats, $18,000. The kind of friendly gesture that comes with expectations. I stood in our kitchen at midnight, holding the evidence of what my wife called workplace friendship. The house felt cold despite the heating running full blast. Everything about our marriage had grown cold lately, but I'd attributed it to stress, work, the usual suspects that plague couples in their 40s. "Jonathan, you're still awake?" Michelle's voice carried from the hallway, that practiced tone she used when caught off guard. Hard to sleep when your wife comes home at midnight smelling like expensive cologne. I held up the receipt. Richard's being very friendly these days. She froze in the doorway, still wearing the black dress I'd never seen before. Designer. Expensive. The kind of outfit that screamed special occasion, not casual work drinks. "His gifts are just friendly gestures," she said, smoothing her hair. "Nothing inappropriate. Richard's just generous with his team. Friends don't gift diamonds, Michelle." I set the receipt on the granite countertop between us, like evidence in a courtroom. 2-carat stones don't come from casual workplace relationships. Her laugh sounded rehearsed. "You're being paranoid. Richard treats all his employees well. It's a thank you for the Henderson account." "The Henderson account you closed 6 months ago?" She shifted her weight, designer heels clicking against the tile. "The follow-up work. There's been extensive follow-up." I'd built my IT consulting business by recognizing patterns, identifying inconsistencies in systems before they caused catastrophic failures. My wife's behavior had developed several critical vulnerabilities lately. "Where did you go tonight?" "I told you. Drinks with the team at Thornton's club. Richard wanted to discuss the Morrison project." "The Morrison project that was canceled last week?" Another pause, another recalculation. "The replacement project. We're developing replacement strategies." The lies were getting more elaborate, more desperate. Michelle had always been skilled at manipulation, but desperation made her sloppy. She was leaving evidence everywhere. "I guess all my fishing buddies just forgot to buy me friendship diamonds," I said, folding the receipt. "Derek must be holding out on me." "Don't be ridiculous, Jonathan. This is business. Richard's just generous. You mentioned that." I opened her purse, ignoring her sharp intake of breath. "What other generous gestures am I missing?" "Keys. Unfamiliar keys attached to a tag reading Ocean View Retreat, R. Thornton." "Beach house keys?" I dangled them in front of her. "More team building?" "Those are for vacation planning, the company retreat." "Vacation planning for the team?" "Exactly." Alone, apparently. Her face flushed. "I was scouting locations. At midnight on a Tuesday. The owner gave me flexible access." The owner, not Richard, not her boss. The owner, as if she'd never mentioned his name, never spent the last 10 minutes defending his friendly gestures. I pocketed the keys. "How flexible?" "Jonathan, you're being paranoid and controlling. Richard's a friend, a colleague, nothing more. Friends don't give friends unlimited access to beach houses either. It's not unlimited. It's temporary, for evaluation purposes." Every answer spawned 3 new questions. Every explanation created 5 new inconsistencies. Michelle was debugging a system that had already crashed. "What else is temporary?" I asked. "The late nights? The new wardrobe? The sudden interest in weekend conferences?" "My career is important to me. Richard recognizes my potential." "I'm sure he does." She stepped closer, switching tactics. "Jonathan, we've been married 12 years. Don't you trust me?" "I trusted you 12 hours ago. Then I found $18,000 worth of friendly gestures in your purse. One gift. One thank you gift. One gift I know about." Her expression shifted, calculating. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm wondering what other friendly gestures you've forgotten to mention. There aren't any others. No other jewelry, no other keys, no other generous thank yous from your very friendly boss?" "No." The word came too quickly, too defensively. Another system vulnerability. Good, I said. Then you won't mind if I verify that. Verify how? By checking. Checking what? Everything. She stared at me for a long moment, her mask slipping. The woman I'd married had been ambitious, driven, occasionally ruthless in business, but she'd never been a liar, at least not to me. I'm going to bed, she said finally. We can discuss this tomorrow when you're being rational. I'm being perfectly rational. Friendly gestures worth $18,000 deserve rational examination. She turned toward the stairs, then paused. Jonathan? Yes? Richard's just being nice. After she disappeared upstairs, I sat alone in our kitchen, studying the keys to another man's beach house, the receipt for another man's diamonds, the evidence of my wife's friendly relationship with another man's generosity. Friends don't gift diamonds. They don't give unlimited access to vacation properties. They don't inspire midnight arrivals in designer dresses. But husbands who discover friendly gestures, they verify everything. I had work to do. Derek Mullins had been my best friend since college and a private investigator for the past 8 years. His office smelled like coffee and cynicism, decorated with case files and a dartboard featuring photos of cheating spouses. Your wife's having an affair, he said before I'd finished explaining. The only question is how much evidence you want before you file for divorce. I want to know everything. Everything's expensive, John, and painful. How expensive? $5,000 for a complete workup. Photos, financial records, timeline, the whole package. Derek leaned back in his chair. How painful depends on what we find. I handed him the diamond receipt and beach house keys. Start with these. Derek examined both items with professional detachment. Richard Thornton. I know the name. Old money family, married to Elizabeth Thornton. She's got more money than God and a prenup that would make a lawyer weep with joy. Prenup? Ironclad infidelity clause. If Richard steps out, she gets everything. House, business, trust funds, the whole empire. Derek grinned. Friendly gestures could cost him about $40 million. $40 million? Elizabeth's grandfather founded Thornton Industries. Richard married into the fortune, but he doesn't own it. She does. He's basically a well-paid employee with a fancy title. This information felt important, though I wasn't sure why yet. What kind of man risks $40 million for an affair? The kind who thinks he's smarter than his wife's lawyers. Derek opened a new file folder. Tell me about Michelle's recent behavior changes. I spent an hour detailing everything. The late nights, expensive clothes, mysterious phone calls, sudden interest in weekend conferences. Derek took notes with the methodical precision of someone who'd heard identical stories hundreds of times. Classic pattern, he said. She's not even being careful. Amateur hour. So what's our next step? Surveillance, financial investigation, background check on Romeo. Derek closed the folder. Give me a week. I drove home through our affluent neighborhood, studying the perfect lawns and expensive cars. Michelle and I had worked hard to afford this lifestyle. I'd built my business from nothing, spending years establishing relationships with corporate clients. She'd climbed the corporate ladder at Thornton Industries, earning promotions through competence and determination. Or so I'd thought. Our house looked exactly the same as when I'd left that morning, but everything felt different. I was seeing my life through new eyes, recognizing patterns I'd previously ignored. Michelle's car wasn't in the driveway. I used the beach house keys. Ocean View Retreat sat on 2 acres of prime coastal property, worth at least $3 million. The kind of place where Richard Thornton entertained clients and, apparently, employees. The house was empty but showed recent use. Fresh flowers in the kitchen, wine glasses in the sink, a woman's earring on the bedroom nightstand. Michelle's earring. The ones I'd bought her for our anniversary. I photographed everything with my phone, documenting the evidence systematically. The earring, the wine glasses, the flowers, the unmade bed. My wife had been here recently. Very recently. I drove back home and waited. Michelle returned at 7, carrying takeout from an expensive restaurant. Sorry I'm late. Richard needed me to review the Patterson proposal. How was the review? Productive. Very productive. She seemed relaxed, confident. Either she was an excellent actress or she genuinely believed her own lies. Did you review it at the office? No, at Richard's club. More privacy for sensitive discussions. Sensitive? The Patterson account is worth $12 million, Jonathan. It requires careful handling. I nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. Must be nice having such a dedicated boss. Richard's very committed to excellence. I'm sure he is. We ate dinner in relative silence, Michelle checking her phone periodically. Each message seemed to improve her mood, which told me everything I needed to know about the sender. I might be late again tomorrow, she said. Richard's planning a strategy session. Another strategy session? The Patterson account requires extensive preparation. Of course it does. After dinner, I retreated to my home office and began my own investigation. Michelle thought she was dating a wealthy entrepreneur, but she was actually risking everything for a man who owned nothing. Richard Thornton's financial situation was more complex than Derek had initially described. According to public records, he controlled significant assets, but owned very little outright. His salary, while substantial, wouldn't support the lifestyle he was projecting. The beach house belonged to Elizabeth Thornton. The cars were registered to Thornton Industries. Even Richard's club membership was corporate-owned. My wife was having an affair with a man who was essentially borrowing his lifestyle from his wife. I spent the next hour researching Elizabeth Thornton. 42 years old, Harvard MBA, board member of 6 major corporations. Her family's wealth dated back 4 generations. She wasn't just rich, she was dynasty rich. More importantly, she was smart. The prenup Derek had mentioned was just the beginning. Elizabeth had protected her family's assets with multiple legal mechanisms. If Richard violated their agreement, he wouldn't just lose half his wealth, he'd lose everything. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Got something. Meet me tomorrow at Monica's bar, 6 p.m. Monica's bar occupied the questionable space between respectable and disreputable, attracting customers who preferred privacy over ambiance. Derek was already waiting when I arrived, nursing a beer and studying a thick folder. Your wife's boyfriend is an idiot, he said without preamble. How big an idiot? The kind who uses company credit cards to buy jewelry for his girlfriend. Derek opened the folder. Richard's been generous with Thornton Industries' expense account. Very generous. He showed me copies of credit card statements. Jewelry purchases, restaurant charges, hotel bills, thousands of dollars in suspicious expenses, all charged to company accounts. Elizabeth could use this to destroy him professionally and personally. Derek continued. Corporate fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, violation of the prenup. She could have him arrested and divorced simultaneously. Does she know? Not yet, but she will soon. Derek pulled out surveillance photos. Michelle and Richard at expensive restaurants. Michelle and Richard entering the beach house. Michelle and Richard at his club. They're not being subtle, Derek said. Half the town knows about their friendly gestures. I studied the photos, recognizing my wife but not recognizing her behavior. She looked happy. Genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. There's more, Derek said. Your wife opened a secret credit card account. Richard's listed as an authorized user. A secret account? P.O. box address you've never seen. Statements go there instead of your house. Derek handed me copies. $40,000 in charges over 6 months. Clothes, jewelry, travel, hotels. $40,000. My wife had been living a secret life, funded by corporate credit cards and hidden accounts. What do you want to do with this information? Derek asked. I thought about Elizabeth Thornton's prenup, about Richard's borrowed lifestyle, about my wife's secret credit cards and friendly gestures. I want to make sure the right people get the right information at the right time. Meaning? Elizabeth Thornton should know what kind of friendly gestures her husband's been making. Derek grinned. I like how you think. Can you compile everything into a comprehensive package? Evidence portfolio, photos, financial records, timeline, locations, the full package. How long? 2 days. Make it 1 day. Friendly gestures shouldn't wait. I spent Wednesday morning organizing evidence with the same methodical approach I used for system audits. Every receipt, every photo, every credit card statement arranged chronologically. The story told itself, 6 months of escalating friendly gestures between my wife and her married boss. Derek delivered the final surveillance photos at noon, Michelle and Richard leaving the beach house together. Michelle wearing the diamond necklace, Richard's hand on Michelle's back as they entered his club. Professional quality, Derek said. Court ready if necessary. It won't be necessary. You sure about that? Elizabeth Thornton won't let this reach court. She'll handle it privately. How do you know? Because public scandals are expensive and she didn't become a billionaire by wasting money on expensive solutions. I assembled the complete package that afternoon. Financial records proving Richard's use of corporate funds for personal expenses. Photos documenting the affair timeline, copies of Michelle's secret credit card statements. Property records showing Elizabeth's ownership of assets Richard had been treating as his own. The cover letter was simple. Thought you should know what friendship means to your husband. No signature, no return address, just facts. I drove to Thornton Industries at 5 p.m. when Elizabeth would be leaving her office. She drove a modest BMW, despite being worth more than most small countries. Old money preferred discretion. She was walking to her car when I approached. Mrs. Thornton? She turned, evaluating me with sharp blue eyes. Yes? I have something you should see. I handed her the package. Information about your husband's business expenses. She accepted the envelope without opening it. Who are you? Someone who believes in transparency. And you're giving me this because? Because friendly gestures have consequences. Elizabeth studied my face for a long moment. I see. She didn't open the package while I watched, but her expression suggested she understood its significance. This wasn't her first suspicious envelope, and it wouldn't be her last. Thank you, she said finally. You're welcome. I drove home, feeling lighter than I had in months. The evidence was delivered. The consequences were inevitable. Michelle's friendly gestures were about to become very expensive for everyone involved. Michelle arrived home at 8, later than usual, but earlier than recent nights. Good day? I asked. Productive. Richard's been very supportive lately. Supportive how? Career guidance. He thinks I have executive potential. Executive potential. Partnership track. Senior management. Real opportunity for advancement. I nodded as if this made perfect sense. Sounds like he's invested in your future. Very invested. Must be nice having such a dedicated mentor. Richard sees potential in people. He's generous with his guidance. Generous, her favorite word lately. What kind of guidance? Strategic thinking, leadership development, executive presence. Executive presence? Professional image, networking, industry connections? Is that what the jewelry was for? Professional image? She paused, remembering our previous conversation. Partly. Richard believes presentation matters in senior roles. So the diamonds were career development? Investment in my professional future. $18,000 worth of professional future? High-level executives dress appropriately. Richard understands that. My wife had rationalized accepting expensive gifts from her married boss as career development. She'd convinced herself that adultery was professional networking. What about the beach house? More career development? Strategic planning retreats. Executive teams need private spaces for sensitive discussions. You and Richard constitute an executive team? Senior staff, decision makers. Making decisions about what? Corporate strategy, long-term planning, future initiatives. Every answer revealed deeper self-deception. Michelle genuinely believed her affair was a business relationship with romantic benefits rather than a romantic relationship with business complications. How long have these strategic planning sessions been happening? 6 months, since the Henderson account. The account that was completed 6 months ago? The follow-up work requires ongoing strategic oversight. By you and Richard. By senior staff members with appropriate clearance. Clearance for what? Sensitive corporate information. What kind of sensitive information requires beach house meetings? She hesitated, realizing the logical inconsistencies in her explanation. Competitive intelligence, industry analysis, strategic positioning. And this intelligence is so sensitive it can't be discussed at the office? Exactly. Or at Richard's club? The club isn't secure. But the beach house is? Private locations ensure confidentiality. My wife had constructed an elaborate fantasy where adultery was corporate espionage and expensive gifts were professional development tools. She'd rationalized every aspect of her affair as career advancement. Sounds like Richard takes security very seriously, I said. Very seriously. He's protective of corporate assets. Including you? Including all senior staff. How protective? Whatever it takes to ensure success. Your success or his success? Both. We're a team. A team. My wife and her married boss were a team engaged in strategic planning that required expensive jewelry, private beach houses, and secret credit cards. What happens when the strategic planning is complete? We implement the initiatives. What kind of initiatives? Long-term corporate restructuring. Restructuring how? Personnel changes, organizational optimization, strategic realignment. Your role in this restructuring? Senior management position. Executive track. Partnership potential. Michelle had convinced herself that Richard was planning to leave his wife and promote her to senior management simultaneously. She believed their affair was a business merger with romantic benefits. When does this restructuring happen? Soon. Richard's finalizing the details. What details? Legal considerations, contractual obligations, transition planning. Sounds complicated. Executive decisions always are. I went to bed that night knowing my wife was living in a fantasy world where adultery was career development and her married lover was planning to restructure his entire life around her professional advancement. Tomorrow, reality would begin its restructuring process. Thursday morning brought the first indication that Elizabeth Thornton had received my package. Richard arrived at work 2 hours late, looking like he'd spent the night arguing with lawyers. Derek called at 10 a.m. Your boy's having a rough day. Elizabeth's attorneys showed up at Thornton Industries this morning with forensic accountants. Forensic accountants? The kind who find missing money. They're auditing Richard's expense accounts, company credit cards, corporate assets, everything. How do you know this? Monica's got connections everywhere. Half the accounting firm drinks at her bar. Monica's bar served as the unofficial information exchange for our town's professional community. Lawyers, accountants, contractors, and investigators gathered there to share gossip disguised as networking. What else is Monica hearing? Elizabeth's moving fast. Asset protection, credit freezes, account restrictions. She's locking down everything Richard has access to. Including? Company cards, joint accounts, the beach house, club memberships. Even his car is being repossessed. His car? Company lease. Elizabeth's pulling all corporate benefits pending the audit results. I felt a surge of satisfaction. Elizabeth Thornton was systematically dismantling Richard's borrowed lifestyle with surgical precision. What about Michelle? Your wife's about to discover that friendly gestures have expiration dates. I spent the morning working from my home office, monitoring my email for client updates while anticipating Michelle's reaction to Richard's changing circumstances. She had no idea that her generous mentor was losing access to his generosity. Michelle called at lunch, her voice strained. "Jonathan, I might be late tonight. Richard's dealing with some corporate issues." "What kind of issues?" "Internal audit, routine compliance review." "Sounds serious." "Just bureaucracy. Elizabeth's being overly cautious about expense procedures." Elizabeth, not Mrs. Thornton, not Richard's wife. Elizabeth, as if Michelle knew her personally. "You know Elizabeth?" "I've met her at corporate functions. She's very involved in company operations." "Involved how?" "Financial oversight, strategic approval. She signs off on major expenditures." "Including Richard's expenditures?" "Including all executive expenses." My wife was beginning to understand that Richard's friendly gestures required his wife's financial approval. The woman funding his generosity was auditing his spending patterns. Must be awkward for Richard. He's handling it professionally. Elizabeth can be demanding about documentation. What kind of documentation? Receipts, justifications, business purposes, standard corporate procedures. For jewelry purchases? Silence. Michelle was connecting dots she'd previously ignored. "The jewelry was a corporate recognition award," she said finally. "Employee appreciation. Tax deductible." $18,000 in tax-deductible employee appreciation? Richard values his staff. Does Elizabeth value Richard's staff equally? She trusts Richard's judgment. About employee appreciation? About all corporate decisions, including beach house access for strategic planning? Another pause. The beach house is a corporate asset. Richard has authorization to use it for business purposes. Authorization from Elizabeth? Authorization from the board. Elizabeth's on the board? She's the board chairwoman. My wife was realizing that every friendly gesture Richard had made required approval from the woman who was now auditing his expenses. The beach house, the jewelry, the credit cards, everything had been funded by Elizabeth Thornton's money and authorized by Elizabeth Thornton's policies. Sounds like Elizabeth has significant influence over Richard's decisions. She's protective of corporate assets, including Richard, including all company resources. What happens if the audit finds irregularities? There won't be any irregularities. Richard's very careful about documentation. Documentation for strategic planning sessions. Documentation for all business activities. At the beach house? Everywhere. My wife was convincing herself that Richard had been documenting their affair as corporate business activities. She believed he'd been filing reports about their strategic planning sessions and expense reports for their friendly gestures. What kind of documentation does strategic planning require? Meeting minutes, agenda items, outcome summaries? For jewelry purchases? For employee recognition ceremonies? At beach houses? At appropriate corporate venues? Michelle had constructed a narrative where adultery was corporate strategy and expensive gifts were employee recognition. She believed Richard had been filing paperwork to justify their affair as business development. Elizabeth must appreciate Richard's attention to documentation. She appreciates thoroughness. Thorough documentation of employee appreciation. Thorough documentation of all corporate activities. Including activities with you? Including all strategic planning initiatives. My wife believed she was a strategic planning initiative requiring thorough documentation for Elizabeth Thornton's approval. When will the audit be complete? Soon. Elizabeth's being very thorough. Thorough about what specifically? Expense verification, asset utilization, resource allocation. Resource allocation? Making sure corporate resources are used appropriately, including Richard's time, including all executive time management. Michelle was beginning to understand that Elizabeth considered Richard's time a corporate resource requiring appropriate allocation. Time spent on strategic planning with Michelle required justification as legitimate business activity. What happens if Elizabeth doesn't approve of Richard's resource allocation? She will. Richard's very effective at strategic planning. With you, with all senior staff. What makes you senior staff? Richard's confidence in my potential. Potential for what? Executive leadership. According to Richard? According to performance metrics. What metrics? Strategic planning effectiveness, initiative development, outcome achievement. My wife believed her affair with Richard was being measured by corporate performance metrics and evaluated for executive leadership potential. Who evaluates these metrics? Richard and the executive committee. Including Elizabeth? Elizabeth reviews all executive evaluations. Including yours? Including all strategic planning participants. Michelle was realizing that Elizabeth Thornton would be evaluating her performance as Richard's strategic planning partner. The woman auditing Richard's expenses would also be reviewing Michelle's corporate contributions. Sounds like Elizabeth has significant input into your career advancement. She has input into all executive decisions. Including Richard's decisions about your potential? Including all strategic planning outcomes. What if Elizabeth doesn't see the same potential Richard sees? She will. The results speak for themselves. What results? Strategic planning effectiveness, corporate value creation, initiative success. What initiatives have you and Richard successfully completed? Silence. Michelle was realizing she couldn't identify any actual business outcomes from 6 months of strategic planning sessions. The initiatives are long-term, she said finally. Results take time to materialize. How long? Corporate restructuring is a gradual process. What restructuring? Organizational optimization, personnel realignment, strategic positioning. When will this restructuring be implemented? When the strategic planning is complete. When will that be? Soon. Richard's finalizing the implementation timeline. With Elizabeth's approval? With full corporate authorization. My wife was convincing herself that Richard was seeking Elizabeth's authorization to implement a corporate restructuring plan that would justify 6 months of strategic planning sessions and expensive employee appreciation. Elizabeth must be very involved in this authorization process. She's very hands-on with major corporate decisions. Including decisions about you? Including all strategic planning outcomes. What if she doesn't authorize the restructuring? She will. Richard's very persuasive about strategic value. Persuasive with Elizabeth? Persuasive with all stakeholders. Even when stakeholders are auditing his expenses. Another long pause. The audit is routine. Elizabeth's just being thorough. About Richard's strategic planning expenses? About all corporate expenditures. Including jewelry for strategic planning participants? Including all employee recognition. $18,000 in employee recognition? Richard believes in appropriate appreciation. Does Elizabeth believe in appropriate appreciation? She trusts Richard's judgment. Even during audits? Especially during audits. The audit will validate Richard's strategic effectiveness. My wife believed the audit would vindicate Richard's expenses and validate their strategic planning relationship. She thought Elizabeth was auditing Richard's accounts to confirm his effectiveness rather than investigate his improprieties. Sounds like this audit will be very revealing, very validating. For Richard? For all strategic planning participants? Including you? Including everyone involved in corporate value creation? Michelle was convinced that Elizabeth's audit would validate her affair with Richard as legitimate corporate value creation worthy of expensive appreciation and strategic planning documentation. Tomorrow would begin her education about the difference between auditing for validation and auditing for termination. Friday morning arrived with the sound of a tow truck in Richard's driveway. Derek called to provide commentary. "They're taking his Porsche," Derek said. "Company car, apparently. Elizabeth's reclaiming all corporate assets." What else? Credit cards canceled, club membership suspended, beach house locks changed. Derek paused. Your wife's about to learn that friendly gestures require ongoing authorization. Michelle called an hour later, her voice tight with strain. Jonathan, something's wrong at work. Richard's having issues with corporate accounts. What kind of issues? Elizabeth's being unreasonable about expense procedures. She's questioning legitimate business expenditures, such as employee recognition, strategic planning costs, corporate development initiatives. The jewelry? The jewelry's being reviewed. Reviewed how? Elizabeth wants additional documentation about the business purpose. What business purpose? Employee appreciation for the Henderson account. The account that closed 6 months ago? The ongoing strategic value creation. My wife was scrambling to construct retroactive business justifications for 6 months of expensive gifts. What kind of documentation does Elizabeth want? Performance metrics, outcome measurements, strategic value assessment. For jewelry? For all employee recognition. What performance metrics justify $18,000 in employee recognition? Corporate value creation, strategic planning effectiveness, initiative development. What initiatives? Long-term organizational optimization. Can you document this optimization? Silence. Michelle was realizing she couldn't provide concrete evidence of any business value created through 6 months of strategic planning sessions. The optimization is ongoing, she said finally. Results are measured over extended periods. How extended? Corporate restructuring takes time. What restructuring? Richard's developing comprehensive organizational improvements. With Elizabeth's approval, Elizabeth's reviewing the strategic framework. What framework? The strategic planning outcomes. What outcomes? Another pause. The outcomes are being compiled for presentation to the executive committee. When? Soon. Richard's preparing the documentation. Documentation of what specifically? Strategic planning effectiveness, corporate value creation, organizational optimization. My wife was repeating corporate buzzwords without understanding their meaning. She believed Richard was preparing documentation to justify their affair as business strategy. What happens if the documentation doesn't satisfy Elizabeth? It will. Richard's very thorough about strategic value. What if Elizabeth doesn't see strategic value in $18,000 worth of jewelry? She will when she reviews the complete strategic framework. What if she doesn't? She has to. The strategic planning has been very effective. Effective how? Corporate relationship building, stakeholder engagement, strategic partnership development. Partnership with whom? Strategic planning participants. Meaning you? Meaning all stakeholders involved in organizational optimization. Michelle was describing her affair with Richard as stakeholder engagement and strategic partnership development, requiring corporate relationship building. Elizabeth's a stakeholder in this strategic planning. Elizabeth's the primary stakeholder. Primary stakeholder in your relationship with Richard? Primary stakeholder in all corporate strategic planning. Including strategic planning that requires jewelry and beach houses? Including all strategic planning initiatives. My wife was realizing that Elizabeth was the primary stakeholder in every aspect of Richard's strategic planning relationship with Michelle. What happens if the primary stakeholder doesn't approve of the strategic planning? She will approve. The strategic planning has created significant value. What value? Organizational effectiveness, strategic positioning, corporate optimization. Can you measure this value? Value measurement is complex for strategic initiatives. Too complex for Elizabeth to understand? Elizabeth understands strategic value. Even when strategic value costs $18,000 in jewelry? Especially then, Elizabeth appreciates appropriate investment in strategic relationships. How do you know what Elizabeth appreciates? Richard explains her priorities. Richard tells you what his wife appreciates? Richard explains corporate priorities. Elizabeth's corporate priorities? All stakeholder priorities, including her priorities about strategic relationships between her husband and female employees. Long silence. Michelle was confronting the reality that Elizabeth might have different priorities regarding Richard's strategic relationships than Richard had indicated. The strategic relationship is purely professional, she said finally. Professional relationships require $18,000 in jewelry? Professional relationships require appropriate appreciation. Appropriate according to whom? According to corporate recognition standards. Elizabeth's standards? Industry standards. What industry standards justify beach house access for strategic planning? Corporate retreat standards, executive development protocols. Elizabeth's protocols? Standard corporate practices. Does Elizabeth consider jewelry and beach house access standard corporate practices for strategic planning with female employees? Elizabeth considers results more important than methods. What results? Strategic planning outcomes. What outcomes? Corporate value creation. What value? Long-term organizational optimization. We were back to circular reasoning. Michelle couldn't identify specific outcomes because there weren't any. 6 months of strategic planning had produced expensive gifts, secret credit cards, and beach house meetings without measurable business results. Michelle, what happens if Elizabeth decides the strategic planning hasn't created sufficient value to justify the expenses? That won't happen. But what if it does? Richard will explain the strategic framework. To Elizabeth? To all stakeholders. What if Elizabeth doesn't accept Richard's explanation? She has to accept it. The strategic planning is documented. Documented how? Meeting records, outcome summaries, strategic assessments. Richard's been documenting your strategic planning sessions? Richard documents all corporate activities, including activities at the beach house, including all strategic planning locations. What kind of documentation? Professional records, strategic outcomes, value assessments. My wife believed Richard had been filing corporate reports about their affair, documenting their beach house meetings as strategic planning sessions and their expensive gifts as value assessments. Elizabeth reviews these documents? Elizabeth reviews all corporate documentation, including documentation about your strategic planning relationship with Richard, including all strategic planning activities. What will Elizabeth think when she reviews documentation about jewelry, beach houses, and strategic planning sessions? She'll appreciate the strategic value creation. What if she doesn't? She will. But what if she doesn't? Then Richard will provide additional explanation. What kind of explanation? Strategic framework clarification, value measurement documentation, outcome verification. What if Elizabeth still doesn't approve? She has to approve. Richard's strategic planning is very effective. According to Richard? According to measurable outcomes. What measurable outcomes? Corporate relationship optimization, strategic partnership development, organizational effectiveness. Elizabeth measures these outcomes. Elizabeth measures all corporate effectiveness, including the effectiveness of Richard's strategic planning relationships, including all strategic planning initiatives. My wife was trapped in circular logic, unable to escape the reality that Elizabeth would be evaluating Richard's strategic planning relationship with Michelle using criteria that probably didn't include adultery as acceptable corporate strategy. Michelle, what happens if Elizabeth concludes that Richard's strategic planning relationship with you wasn't appropriate corporate strategy? That won't happen. Why not? Because the strategic planning created value. What value? Strategic value. Measured how? Corporate metrics. Elizabeth's metrics? Industry standard metrics. What metrics? Strategic effectiveness measurements. We'd completed a full circle of corporate nonsense. Michelle was defending adultery as strategic effectiveness. measured by industry standard metrics that she couldn't identify or explain. "I have to go," she said abruptly. "Richard needs help with the documentation." "Documentation for Elizabeth?" "Documentation for all stakeholders." "Good luck with that." "Thank you." After she hung up, I sat in my office contemplating the elaborate self-deception my wife had constructed. She'd convinced herself that adultery was corporate strategy, that expensive gifts were employee recognition, and that Elizabeth Thornton would appreciate strategic planning that included jewelry and beach houses. Tomorrow, Elizabeth would begin educating both Richard and Michelle about her actual appreciation for strategic planning relationships between her husband and female employees. The education would be expensive. Saturday morning brought the final phase of Elizabeth's response. Derek called with updates from Monica's intelligence network. "Divorce papers were served this morning," Derek said. "Elizabeth's not wasting time on counseling or mediation." "How's Richard handling it?" "Badly. He showed up at Monica's at 10 a.m., already 3 drinks ahead of schedule." "What's he saying?" "That Elizabeth's being unreasonable, that the audit is vindictive, that his strategic planning was legitimate business development." "Strategic planning?" "That's what he's calling it. Strategic planning with Michelle to develop corporate synergies." Richard was using the same corporate buzzwords Michelle had been repeating. They'd coordinated their story, believing they could convince Elizabeth that adultery was business strategy. "Is Michelle with him?" "Not yet, but she's been calling every 10 minutes. "Calling Richard?" "Calling Richard, calling the office, calling anyone who might explain why her strategic planning partner's assets are being repossessed." I drove to Monica's bar to observe the final act of Richard's strategic planning career. He was sitting alone at the far end of the bar, staring at legal documents while nursing whiskey. "Jonathan?" Richard looked up as I approached. "What are you doing here?" "Heard you were having strategic planning difficulties." His face flushed. "Elizabeth's being unreasonable about legitimate business expenses." $18,000 in legitimate business expenses? Employee recognition. Michelle's been very effective at strategic planning. Strategic planning that requires jewelry? Strategic planning that requires appropriate appreciation for exceptional performance. Richard was drunk enough to believe his own lies. He genuinely thought he could justify adultery as employee recognition and affair expenses as strategic planning costs. What exceptional performance? Corporate value creation, organizational optimization, strategic relationship development. With your wife's money? With corporate funds allocated for strategic planning initiatives. Elizabeth's corporate funds? Thornton Industries corporate funds. Elizabeth owns Thornton Industries. Elizabeth's a stakeholder in strategic planning effectiveness. Richard was too drunk to recognize the logical contradictions in his explanation. He was defending using Elizabeth's money to buy jewelry for his girlfriend as stakeholder investment in strategic planning effectiveness. What does Elizabeth think about your strategic planning effectiveness? Elizabeth doesn't understand strategic planning complexity. The woman with a Harvard MBA doesn't understand strategic planning. Elizabeth focuses on financial metrics rather than strategic value. What strategic value? Long-term organizational optimization through strategic relationship development. Meaning adultery? Meaning professional relationship building with high-potential employees. High-potential employees who require $18,000 in jewelry? High-potential employees who deserve appropriate recognition for strategic planning contributions? Richard was describing Michelle as a high-potential employee, deserving expensive recognition for strategic planning contributions that he couldn't identify or measure. What contributions? Strategic framework development, corporate synergy creation, organizational effectiveness optimization. Can you document these contributions? Documentation is being compiled for stakeholder review. Elizabeth's review? All stakeholder review. What will Elizabeth think when she reviews documentation about strategic planning sessions at beach houses? She'll appreciate the strategic value creation. What if she doesn't? She has to. The strategic planning created measurable value. What measurable value? Corporate relationship optimization. Between you and Michelle? Between all strategic planning participants. Elizabeth's a strategic planning participant? Elizabeth's the primary stakeholder in strategic planning outcomes. Richard was too drunk to realize he was describing his wife as the primary stakeholder in his affair with Michelle. What outcomes is Elizabeth expecting from your strategic planning with Michelle? Organizational effectiveness, strategic positioning, corporate optimization. What if Elizabeth concludes that your strategic planning with Michelle didn't create organizational effectiveness? That's impossible. The strategic planning was very effective. Effective at what? Strategic relationship development. What kind of strategic relationship? Professional partnership, corporate collaboration, organizational synergy. Elizabeth appreciates professional partnerships that require jewelry and beach houses. Elizabeth appreciates results. What results? Strategic planning results. Such as? Corporate value creation. What corporate value did your strategic planning with Michelle create? Richard stared at his whiskey, unable to answer. 6 months of strategic planning with Michelle had produced no measurable corporate value, no organizational effectiveness, no strategic positioning improvements. The value is long-term, he said finally. How long-term? Strategic planning requires extended implementation periods. How extended? Corporate restructuring takes time. What restructuring? Organizational optimization, personnel realignment, strategic repositioning. When will this restructuring be implemented? When the strategic planning documentation is complete. What documentation? Strategic framework assessment, value measurement analysis, outcome verification. Who's preparing this documentation? Strategic planning participants. You and Michelle? All stakeholders involved in organizational optimization. Including Elizabeth? Elizabeth reviews all strategic planning documentation. What will Elizabeth's review conclude? That the strategic planning created significant value. What if her review concludes the opposite? That's impossible. Why? Because the strategic planning was professionally conducted according to corporate standards. Elizabeth standards? Industry standards. What industry standards govern strategic planning relationships between married executives and female employees? Richard's expression shifted as he confronted the reality that no industry standards justified his affair with Michelle as legitimate strategic planning. The strategic planning was appropriate, he said defensively. Appropriate according to whom? According to strategic planning protocols. Elizabeth's protocols? Corporate protocols. What corporate protocols authorize jewelry purchases for strategic planning participants? Employee recognition protocols. What employee recognition protocols authorize beach house access for strategic planning sessions? Executive development protocols? Elizabeth's executive development protocols? Standard corporate development practices. Does Elizabeth consider adultery a standard corporate development practice? The strategic planning wasn't adultery. What was it? Professional relationship development. Professional relationships require jewelry and secret beach house meetings. Professional relationships require appropriate collaboration environments. Elizabeth considers beach houses appropriate collaboration environments for her husband's professional relationships with female employees. Elizabeth considers results more important than methods. What results? Strategic planning results. We'd completed another circle of corporate nonsense. Richard was defending adultery as strategic planning that created unmeasurable results using inappropriate methods that Elizabeth would supposedly appreciate, despite filing for divorce and repossessing his assets. Richard, what happens when Elizabeth's forensic accountants finish reviewing your strategic planning expenses? They'll validate the strategic value creation. What if they don't? They have to. The strategic planning was legitimate. Legitimate, according to whom? According to strategic planning standards. Elizabeth standards? Professional standards. What professional standards authorize using corporate credit cards to buy jewelry for extramarital strategic planning partners? Richard stared at his legal documents, finally confronting the reality that no professional standards justified his behavior. Elizabeth's being vindictive, he said finally. Elizabeth's protecting her assets. From what? From strategic planning expenses that look suspiciously like adultery funding. The strategic planning was legitimate business development. Business development that cost Elizabeth $40 million? The strategic planning didn't cost $40 million. The divorce will. Richard's face went pale as he realized the financial consequences of his strategic planning relationship with Michelle. Elizabeth can't take everything. Elizabeth owns everything. You signed a prenup. The prenup doesn't apply to legitimate business activities. Adultery isn't a legitimate business activity. The strategic planning wasn't adultery. What was it? Professional collaboration. Professional collaboration that violated your prenup and triggered Elizabeth's infidelity clause? The infidelity clause doesn't apply to strategic planning. It applies to strategic planning that includes jewelry, beach houses, and secret credit cards. Richard was finally understanding that his strategic planning relationship with Michelle had triggered the prenup's infidelity clause, giving Elizabeth legal justification to claim all marital assets. What about Michelle? What about her? She was just participating in strategic planning. Strategic planning that's going to cost her marriage, her job, and her lifestyle. Her marriage? Her husband knows about the strategic planning. Richard's expression shifted to panic. How does her husband know? The same way Elizabeth knows, evidence has a way of reaching interested parties. What evidence? Photos, financial records, documentation, the complete strategic planning portfolio? Who compiled this portfolio? Someone who believes in transparency. Richard stared at me, finally recognizing my role in his strategic planning difficulties. You're Michelle's husband. I'm Michelle's soon-to-be ex-husband. You sent the evidence to Elizabeth? I thought she should know what friendship means to her husband. Why? Because friendly gestures have consequences. Richard sat in stunned silence, realizing that his strategic planning relationship with Michelle had been systematically documented and delivered to the one person with the power and motivation to destroy both their lives. What do you want? Nothing. The consequences are already in motion. What consequences? Elizabeth's divorce, Michelle's termination, your financial ruin, the complete dismantling of your strategic planning relationship. Michelle's being terminated? Elizabeth owns Thornton Industries. Strategic planning participants who engage in affairs with married executives typically find their strategic planning careers concluded. When? Monday morning. Elizabeth's being thorough about organizational optimization. Richard was learning that Elizabeth's organizational optimization would include eliminating strategic planning participants who created liability rather than value. This is vindictive. This is consequences. For strategic planning, for adultery funded by corporate credit cards and justified as strategic planning. The strategic planning was legitimate. The strategic planning was expensive. Elizabeth's reclaiming her investment. What investment? Jewelry, beach houses, credit cards, your salary, your benefits, your lifestyle. Everything she funded that you used to support your strategic planning relationship with Michelle. Elizabeth can't take everything. Elizabeth can take everything she owns, which is everything. Richard was finally understanding that his strategic planning had been funded entirely by Elizabeth's money, giving her legal and financial justification to reclaim all assets used to support his affair. What about Michelle? Michelle's learning that strategic planning relationships have expiration dates. When? Right now. I pointed toward the bar entrance where Michelle was walking in, looking desperate and confused. She spotted Richard immediately and hurried over. Richard, what's happening? Your phone's disconnected, your office is locked, and security won't let me in the building. Elizabeth's being unreasonable about the strategic planning audit. What audit results? The audit concluded that our strategic planning wasn't appropriate corporate strategy. That's impossible. Our strategic planning created significant value. Elizabeth doesn't appreciate strategic value. She has to appreciate it. We documented everything. The documentation wasn't sufficient. What wasn't sufficient? Elizabeth wanted different documentation. What kind of documentation? Documentation that we couldn't provide. Why not? Because the strategic planning didn't create the kind of value Elizabeth expected. Michelle looked confused and panicked. What kind of value did Elizabeth expect? Measurable corporate value. Our strategic planning created measurable value. What measurable value? Strategic relationship development. Elizabeth doesn't consider strategic relationship development sufficient justification for $18,000 in jewelry. Why not? Because strategic relationship development looks like adultery when it includes jewelry, beach houses, and secret credit cards. Michelle's face went pale as she finally understood Elizabeth's perspective on their strategic planning relationship. Elizabeth thinks we were having an affair? Elizabeth knows you were having an affair. But we documented everything as strategic planning. Documentation doesn't change reality. What reality? That you were using corporate funds to support an extramarital relationship. The relationship was professional. Professional relationships don't require jewelry and beach house meetings. Our strategic planning required appropriate collaboration environments. Elizabeth considers adultery an inappropriate collaboration environment regardless of location. Michelle was confronting the reality that Elizabeth had evaluated their strategic planning relationship as adultery rather than corporate strategy. What happens now? Now you experience the consequences of strategic planning that Elizabeth considers adultery. What consequences? Termination, divorce, financial ruin, public humiliation. When? The process has already started. Michelle turned to me, finally recognizing my presence. Jonathan? What are you doing here? Observing the conclusion of your strategic planning career. You know about the strategic planning? I know about everything. The jewelry, the beach house, the secret credit cards, the corporate expenses, the documentation, everything. How? The same way Elizabeth knows. Evidence has a way of reaching interested parties. You sent evidence to Elizabeth? I thought she should know what friendship means to her husband. Michelle stared at me in shock, realizing I'd been the source of Elizabeth's information about her strategic planning relationship with Richard. Why? Because friendly gestures have consequences. What consequences? The consequences you're experiencing right now. This is vindictive. This is accountability. For strategic planning? For adultery disguised as strategic planning. The strategic planning was legitimate. The strategic planning was expensive. Elizabeth's reclaiming her investment. What investment? Everything she funded that supported your affair with her husband. Michelle was finally understanding that her strategic planning relationship with Richard had been funded entirely by the woman who was now destroying both their lives. Elizabeth can't take everything. Elizabeth can take everything she owns. What does she own? Everything Richard used to support your strategic planning. The jewelry, the beach house, the credit cards, his salary, his benefits, his lifestyle, everything. What about my job? Strategic planning participants who engage in affairs with married executives typically find their strategic planning careers concluded. When? Monday morning. What about my marriage? Strategic planning relationships tend to complicate marriages. You're divorcing me? I'm divorcing someone who thought adultery was career development. Michelle looked between Richard and me, finally understanding the complete consequences of her strategic planning relationship. This isn't fair. Fair would have been honest communication about your strategic planning interests before you started accepting jewelry and beach house access from married men. The strategic planning was professional. Professional strategic planning doesn't require lying to your husband about jewelry, beach houses, and secret credit cards. I was protecting your feelings. You were protecting your strategic planning relationship. The relationship was legitimate. The relationship was adultery funded by another woman's money. Michelle sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. What happens now? Now you live with the consequences of your strategic planning choices. What choices? Choosing adultery over marriage, choosing deception over honesty, choosing another woman's husband over your own. I chose career advancement. You chose expensive gifts and beach house meetings with a married man. The gifts were employee recognition. The gifts were adultery funding. The beach house meetings were strategic planning sessions. The beach house meetings were affair locations. The strategic planning was legitimate business development. The strategic planning was elaborate self-deception designed to justify adultery as career advancement. Michelle stared at her hands, finally confronting the reality that her strategic planning relationship with Richard had been adultery disguised as corporate strategy. I believed it was legitimate. You wanted to believe it was legitimate. Richard said it was strategic planning. Richard said what you wanted to hear. He said Elizabeth would appreciate the strategic value. He said what he needed to say to continue the affair. The strategic planning created value. The strategic planning created consequences. What consequences? The consequences you're experiencing right now. Divorce, termination, financial ruin, public humiliation. This is vindictive. This is reality. Michelle looked at Richard, who was staring into his whiskey. Richard, what do we do now? Now we face the consequences of our strategic planning. What consequences? Elizabeth's consequences. What are Elizabeth's consequences? Complete financial and professional destruction. For strategic planning? For adultery that cost her $40 million. Michelle was finally understanding that her strategic planning relationship with Richard had triggered Elizabeth's prenup infidelity clause, giving Elizabeth legal justification to claim all marital assets and destroy both their careers. $40 million? The cost of strategic planning that Elizabeth considers adultery. The strategic planning wasn't worth $40 million. The strategic planning cost $40 million. How? Prenup infidelity clause. When you engage in strategic planning relationships with married billionaires, the strategic planning becomes very expensive. Michelle sat in stunned silence, finally comprehending the financial magnitude of her strategic planning choices. I didn't know about the prenup. You didn't ask about the prenup. Richard said Elizabeth appreciated strategic planning. Richard said what he needed to say to continue funding your strategic planning with Elizabeth's money. Elizabeth's money? Elizabeth owns everything. The jewelry, the beach house, the credit cards, Richard's salary. Everything you thought was Richard's generosity was actually Elizabeth's money. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. Michelle looked around the bar, seeing the curious stares of other patrons who were witnessing the conclusion of her strategic planning career. What happens now? Now you live with the consequences of strategic planning that cost a billionaire $40 million. What consequences? Whatever consequences Elizabeth considers appropriate for strategic planning participants who engage in affairs with her husband using her money. What kind of consequences? The kind that ensure strategic planning participants remember the cost of strategic planning relationships with married billionaires. Michelle stood up unsteadily. I need to go. Where? Home. To think. To plan. To plan what? My next steps. Your next steps have already been planned. By whom? By Elizabeth. Your strategic planning career is over. Your marriage is over. Your lifestyle is over. Elizabeth's been very thorough about planning your consequences. Michelle walked toward the exit, then turned back. Jonathan, can we talk about this privately? We can talk about it through lawyers. I made mistakes. You made choices. I chose poorly. You chose adultery and called it strategic planning. I thought it was legitimate. You thought it was profitable. I thought Richard cared about my career. Richard cared about having an affair funded by his wife's money. I thought Elizabeth would appreciate strategic planning. Elizabeth appreciates strategic planning. She doesn't appreciate adultery. The strategic planning wasn't adultery. The strategic planning was adultery with corporate documentation. Michelle left without another word. Richard finished his whiskey and followed her out. I sat alone at the bar, contemplating the conclusion of their strategic planning relationship. 6 months of elaborate self-deception had collapsed in a single conversation, leaving both participants to face the consequences of choices they'd disguised as corporate strategy. Elizabeth Thornton had been thorough, systematic, and devastatingly effective. She'd dismantled Richard's borrowed lifestyle, terminated Michelle's career, and reclaimed every asset used to support their affair. Friendly gestures had consequences. Strategic planning had costs. Adultery disguised as corporate strategy had prices that neither participant could afford. The education was complete. The consequences were delivered. The strategic planning relationship was permanently concluded.